Welcome back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and Baltimore Positive. We've changed the set around here a little bit. I've learned virtual background out on the interwebs, but Luke Jones still has his Orioles and Ravens pennants behind him, and we're hoping to add another Super Bowl logo onto at least one of those. I don't know so much on the baseball side, Luke, but certainly for this sort of soft underbelly of the sports schedule, the Terps have provided a little bit of fun here the last week or so. But there is that tick-tock on the thing that matters the most, which is the football team and free agency. And it is a very, very busy time of the year in most places. I had Joe Douglas on this week. You could check him out at Baltimore Positive. He's a little busy up in New York, too.
Yeah, I mean, it really is that time where even if there aren't necessarily the headlines every single day, I mean, certainly there was a big headline at the end of last week with Carson Wentz being traded to Indianapolis. Even if you're not having a headline like that every day or every other day, there's a lot going on. And I think with the Ravens, for me, it kind of begins with how much change we've seen to the coaching staff. As much as we talked about Wink Martindale and Greg Roman the last couple of years, you see how many assistants have left. In many cases, a promotion. In other cases, when you look, it's a position coach to a different position coach elsewhere. You do wonder if it's, maybe a case of it's time to move on a little bit. Not that John Harbaugh is unhappy with guys or that guys were unhappy with the Ravens, but it's really tough moving up the ladder in the NFL coaching business. I mean, we've talked about it all the time. Families and there are life considerations, all types of things of that nature. But when you're looking at the Ravens now over the weekend, Craig Versteeg, who's been one of John Harbaugh's assistants since the beginning in 2008, although he's kind of been just a senior offensive assistant and jack of all trades, helping out here and there. He becomes the running backs coach, Matt Weiss, joining Jim Harbaugh's staff in Michigan after Mike McDonald also joined the Wolverines staff earlier this offseason. But I think that's now 9 assistant coaches, either assistant coaches or coaching analysts, who have now moved on to a job elsewhere, which I'm not suggesting there's any, there's nothing scandalous or anything about like that, but you do wonder if it's a case of, hey, you've been here for a while in this role. We don't necessarily have a quote promotion for you. Is a change of scenery what's best for you? Is, privately, is that what's best for the organization? Just to get some new blood, some new ideas, to evolve, as John Harbaugh likes to say. He's very, he very much likes to say you're either getting better or you're getting worse. So, in the case of some of these coaches moving on, it's not that they weren't, they've won 25 games the last 2 years. It's not as though they haven't been successful, but you do wonder if you bring in some new blood, some new ideas, some new eyeballs, some guys who've coached at the collegiate level recently, and see if you can get a little bit better. See if you can bring some new ideas to the table. And for coaches who've been here for a while, or someone like Zach Orr, for example, who had been a coaching analyst, he goes to Jacksonville, and he's now outside linebackers coach, with Joe Cullen being the DC down there for Urban Meyer. So,
well, that's the career path you'd want to take, right?
Yeah.
That's what Jack Del Rio, who was a linebacker, would tell him if you're a player and you want to do this. Rick Lyle was another guy. Anthony Weaver's another guy who's back here, right? Like, who played the game, made a nice living, but there's a nice living in being a defensive line coach in the NFL, right?
There is, but the other part of that is typically it's not going to happen in one place in terms of climbing the ladder. You're going to be...
It's a nomadic lifestyle, right?
Yeah, it really is.
By the way, we had John Feinstein on. Don and I talked to him to get a little breezy here with you, and we were talking about Ryan Odom and all the chances he had, to go take a job somewhere after you beat Virginia, and he's still there. And, the question is, like, how long for you? But you want the next gig to be your gig. You know what I mean? Like, John Harbaugh lasted forever in Philadelphia. He's lasted forever here. That's very unusual because the first couple of years he was in Cincinnati and running around these different places. Most of these coaches in every sport, you have to be nomadic in order to exist, right? So when you're not nomadic, when you're Craig Versteeg and you've been in some place for 13 years and you've been able to raise your family, and I see him in Fellowship of Christian Athletes every year. He and John are very close. He's come to my events before. He's one of the guys around there that's familiar to me. A lot of these names, I don't know these guys. I've never gotten to know these guys. I don't even know if these guys are black or white, whether they're left-handed, right-handed. You see them once a year. they're just a name. Unless you look them up online, most fans don't know who the secondary coach is most of the time. I think it may have been different a generation ago, and I think Billick was different about those. Those guys used to come and sit in my studio. David Shaw would drive over and sit down in WNST because he wanted a gig. That's how I got to know Jed, the Fish, and that's how you get to know Mike Pettin or Jim Schwartz or any of these people. They run it differently, and I think there's a little thing maybe you could clear up for me, but if you're on the offensive side of the ball and you're in the Lamar offense, you're only going to go so far in your career path as far as developing things when this offense is, it may work at the collegiate level from a coaching schematic standpoint, but in most NFL departments, if you hang out here 5-6 years with Lamar, you're going to be a part of that Brady bunch. You know what I mean? Like you're not going to be thought of as a mind around aerial football, right? So there is a little bit of the philosophy in the players as well as winning and losing. I mean, look at Anthony Weaver coming here. Anybody that's around that Houston mess down there right now, right? There's going to be a little odor to that, right? And there's an odor to when you lose, and there's some perfume when you win. So the fact that guys are leaving because they're on a career path after you've pointed out they've had 2 very successful seasons here, now is the time to go if your future is in Detroit or Cincinnati or college ball, that if you're not going to be the head coach of the Baltimore Ravens, you're going to bump your head here, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that.
And I think there's some of that in general. I don't think that's necessarily even just a Ravens-only thing, although I think that's an interesting point. And certainly 2 years from now, if there is an unbelievable mobile dual threat quarterback that's somewhere in the neighborhood of Lamar Jackson, athletically speaking, and we know Lamar really has no peer when you're talking about the rushing side.
Yeah, you're going to want Greg Roman to be your head coach, maybe.
Yeah, Greg Roman or James Urban as an OC because he's worked with Lamar for a couple years. But you're right. But I think there is a sense of not wanting to become just locked into one place for so long. I mean, Craig Versteegen, I say this with no disrespect. Good man, as you mentioned, he's been here a long time, coached with John Harbaugh at Cincinnati way back when, I believe it was, at the collegiate level. I think it was Cincinnati. But when you're in one spot for 12, 13 years and you kind of look at his titles, offensive assistant, senior offensive assistant / quarterbacks, offensive assistant / running backs. He hasn't had a high profile job. I mean, him being promoted to running backs coach is the highest profile job that he's had, where he's a definitive position coach. When you are in a place for 12 or 13 years, and I got a little bit of this on Twitter, and some of it is fans and certain followers just want to be concerned or complain about anything here or there. Probably most people who would complain about this didn't know that Matt Weiss was the running backs coach before Craig Versteegen.
And Matt was like John's right-hand guy.
He had a lot of different jobs. Sure, yeah.
Matt was a guy that came in answering the phones and learning football in the same way that Joe Douglas explained to me that his first assignment was to pick Sam Gash up at the airport. You know what I mean? I think Matt came in the door that way, and John has spawned these leaders of men, right? John found young guy. Matt Weiss was young, man. I mean, all these guys are young in their 20s and whatnot. But then you look up and they get head coaching jobs 10, 12 years later. I mean, David Shaw was young when he was in my studio, right? We were all young once. But John has had 2 ways to go about this, right? John has never had his cupboard cleared since Rex Ryan, right? And Mike Pettin left, where he's had these older Mattson, these Dean Pease, these guys that were not head coaching candidates, but were brilliant ball coaches. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And John's had an interesting run, I think, over 13 years as to how he wants to run it. But when guys are leaving, I don't know that at some point it's fly be free, right? If you've been around 10 years.
I think so. I mean, are there examples where privately, and look, you made this point, we don't really get to know these guys all that well. I mean, that was particularly true this past year where, I mean, you might have gotten them on a Zoom once all season, back in training camp. So very unique circumstances that way. But yeah, I think for the most part, you look at some of these guys. I mean, we just mentioned Matt Weiss. I have his bio right here. Joined the Ravens in 2009. Here are the titles he's held since coming to Baltimore.
How old was he in 2009? I'm going to say 23.
I think he was a little bit older. He's actually right around my age. He was born in 1983, so he
So he
was
was 26. Okay.
26.
All right.
But his title since joining the Ravens: head coach's assistant for 3 years, defensive quality control for 2 years, another year defensive quality control linebackers assistant coach. 2015 cornerbacks coach, 2016 and 17 offensive assistant, 2018 football strategy coordinator and wide receivers
But if
assistant.
he's going to be the head
You
coach
know,
at
he
Colorado, he's got to leave soon, right?
well, and that's the point. And I think sometimes that's a mutual thing. Not to say that John Harbaugh is unhappy with Matt Weiss or that Matt Weiss is unhappy with the Ravens. I think there is a sense of you get everything you can out of in a certain organization, certain responsibilities, and if it's blocked, and look, if Greg Roman gets hired last off season and someone else has moved up and Matt Weiss has a different spot, not that he'd be the OC, but you could see a progression, a roadmap, so to speak, if you're him and if you're the Ravens looking at him as an asset to your staff. But if a guy's blocked and he's been somewhere for over a decade, sometimes there is a case of, and it can even be mutual, as much as we hear the mutual departing with head coaches, and we know that that's never really the case. You hear that language. I think in some of these cases, that is something that there's some validity to, because these guys see it. And as you mentioned, it's a very nomadic kind of lifestyle in terms of if you're trying to move up the ladder. Now, are there guys, you mentioned Ryan Odom, Craig Versteeg's been here since 2008. Are there some guys that perhaps value a little more stability?
Well,
Maybe
listen,
they're,
Rex Ryan was here a long time, right? I
yeah,
mean, Wade Harmon was here a long time. I mean, there are guys
sure,
that were here because this is a great place. I mean, we talk about it all the time that
no question.
people don't love leaving here. I mean, Joe Douglas was here 14 years. He's now in his third spot, but that's what he had to do to be the GM of the Jets. But for him and DeCosta, all those guys, they get offers all the time. There's always moving parts, right? I mean, you're on John Harbaugh's staff. You're qualified to work in a lot of places that you might not want the job at Sacramento State this year. You know what I mean? Like,
Sure.
to make 10 grand more and move your family or whatever.
Well, and that's the thing. I mean, there's so many other life considerations that we don't take into account, and very, in many cases, don't even become public. Someone
Wives and
has a
children.
sick,
Let's start with that. We all
a
have
sick
them.
parent, or right, exactly. So, but to the point you just made, you have Anthony Weaver, who was a Raven, did not coach here, but clearly had an affinity for the organization. Now, the mess in Houston cost him his job, but he was well thought of. He comes back to Baltimore. He's familiar with the organization.
Still
Jason
has a hat.
Brooks,
Still my Facebook
Jason
friend.
Brooks, new assistant defensive line coach Jason Brooks, had been here with the Ravens before. He is the son of the late CB, Clarence Brooks. He's the assistant D-line coach now. So you
By the
bring
way,
some
dude,
guys
because
back.
we're talking about this and you just said Clarence Brooks, I just hold your thought. I want to share this with you because I found this picture. This is old school, dude. See, there's CB right there. I found it. I haven't
That's
shared
great.
these, so I'm going to share this with Jason at some point. Mike Peck.
Very cool.
We were all younger then. I had nice pants, too. But go ahead. So Jason Brooks, I interrupted you.
Yeah. Well, it's just, you see some of the names that come in here, and, some of these guys, which I think is interesting, if you're looking at the Ravens. And again, let's bring it back to how the 2021 Ravens are getting better. How is this football team evolving? How is it moving forward, not growing complacent? You do make some changes to your coaching staff, or some additions to your coaching staff, and you bring in a T. Martin as your wide receivers coach, replacing David Culley. T. Martin, a guy who's was considered an ascending coach at the collegiate level, and has worked with some good players, and is someone that is considered to have some good ideas. Pass game specialist Keith Williams comes in, again, someone who's worked at the collegiate level. You look at the collection of coaches John Harbaugh has brought in, and look, I'm not going to buffalo you and say that I've heard of each one of these guys and I was intimately familiar with their resumes. But when you look at them collectively, other than Weaver and Rob Ryan, who, of course, Rex's brother, comes in to coach the inside linebackers, the rest of these guys have recent collegiate coaching experience. And I think, one, that makes a lot of sense just in terms of The players continue to stay a certain age. Coaches get older. Players cycling in are still in their early 20s, right? And we know how much the collegiate game has changed over the years and how that's evolved and how the Ravens have implemented that on the offensive side of the ball with different concepts. But you bring in some collegiate minds. One, they tend to be hungrier guys because they're not making the same money at the collegiate level in most cases as they are at the NFL level. And they're working with 18 to 22-year-olds. They're working in environments that are different from the NFL. And that's not to say you just, sight unseen, you just hire a college coach. But if it's someone that fits a specific need, a specific goal that you might have. I mentioned T. Martin and I mentioned Keith Williams.
By the
Two
way, the
guys
only time I ever went to Knoxville, T. Martin was flinging it down there.
Yeah, the guy who got it done after Peyton Manning was the guy in Knoxville. He's the one who won a national championship.
Play with Jamal.
Yeah, exactly. So, but I think you look at these names and you want some new blood. I think it's a healthy thing to cycle in some new blood in your coaching staff, and I think, I think a lot of times that just happens organically, just because coordinators get head coaching jobs or certain guys get fired because they aren't productive. That wasn't the case here, but I do think you look at John Harbaugh probably would privately tell you, as much as there's some guys he lost that, yeah, he would have liked to keep all things equal. He would privately tell you it's good for us to bring in some new names, some new voices, some new eyeballs, some new brains to look at what we have, critique what hasn't worked quite as well or what can get even better, and try to see how that works. We always focus on the player side of this, and ultimately you need to have talent. I mean, you're not going to win on great coaching alone. We understand that, but there are different ways to get better beyond just talking about signing free agents, making trades, and drafting players. So this is something that you look to, and you see I think 9 assistants and coaching analysts have departed. I believe they've brought in 7 new names. That's a way that they're evolving. They're not staying the same. Now, it's not guaranteed that that's going to make them better. It's not guaranteed that every position coach that comes in replacing someone else is going to take guys to new heights. Sometimes it doesn't work out. But one thing you certainly can say, looking at the coaching staff, they're eliminating the likelihood of complacency because, well, a lot of these guys haven't been around the last couple of years. So they're going to be plenty hungry to bring in new ideas, evolve, make changes, make tweaks. It's not as though this football team has a lot of issues. They have a couple things here and there, but coming off of an 11-5 season and being in the divisional round, they're not that far away. But I am interested to see what some of these young assistants, some of these lesser known assistants coming in, what kind of fingerprints they can leave on this organization to try to get this team to its next Super Bowl.
Luke Jones is here. He is Baltimore Luke, and Luke at WNST.net. We start talking about coaches and this time of the year and the off season and, whether there's stability and all of that. I do want to give a little plug for my Joe Douglas piece. It took Joe a month to get back to me because he's drafting second, and we were going to talk Super Bowl 35 and all of that. But this is the time of the year where, and especially in the middle of a plague where individual workouts in Indianapolis and how much tape do we have and who do we know on campus that knows this kid, man, there's a lot of duck paddling going on under the water that, maybe most fans don't realize because the season's over. The Super Bowl's a couple weeks ago. Unless you and I are in Indianapolis freezing this week and talking about it, or the Underwear Olympics are on, right? You don't notice it, but man, it's a grind time. It's a very, very busy time in Owings Mills for lots and lots of people, not necessarily football players.
No question about it. And you mentioned it, with this still being the reality of the pandemic, and hopefully, a year from now, we're actually talking about the combine again, and vaccines have rolled out, and herd immunity, whatever, that life is normal again. Football life is normal again, or at least very close to it. But I think this is going to be such a fascinating process that we're not necessarily going to get a lot of details about because, if you're Eric DeCosta or you're Joe Douglas or you're any general manager around the league, any edge you can find in this pre-draft process that's very unique in terms of not having a conventional combine, not having conventional visits, knowing that all these guys, you'll get data, but it's going to be from their pro days and things of that nature. You'll have the medical checks, but beyond that, it's a very different process. And that's coming off of a college football season that was extremely different. And in some cases, guys opted out entirely. In some cases, guys played for a team that only played 5 or 6 games. I mean, you have a lot of different dynamics here that
it's a lot less
I
information.
yeah,
I think the high wire is a lot higher this year that you can fall if you don't do this right.
I think there's going to, and you're right, but I think the other interesting thing here, and this is where, okay, the Ravens have this fantastic reputation for the draft, as they should. You look at the history, you look at the track record, speaks for itself. But I think this year, when you don't have a combine where the entire league is congregating and watching workouts, and Nestor, so much of the combine is not about the actual combine itself. It's about going out and having a shrimp cocktail and talking to an agent, talking to another general manager, talking to guys in the league.
That was not you, me, Marvin, and Mike Smith drinking tequila two in the morning. That was not us.
Well, that certainly that's fun, but I'm talking about guys within the league, and they're talking shop. And I think one thing that could be eliminated here, and this can either be a good thing or it can be a bad thing, depending on the case. There's probably less of an opportunity for groupthink this year. And look, you get some of that with draft pundits and the Mel Kipers and the Todd McShays and the Matt Millers of the world, who, by the way, when they put together their mock drafts, they're talking to people around the league. It's not as though they're just sitting there and saying, well, I really like this guy, but they don't talk to anyone. They talk to people. But so you'll still have some of that in terms of groupthink, but when you're not having executives and scouts and general managers and scouting directors all congregating in Indianapolis and watching guys and saying, hey, what have you heard about this guy? Hey, I've heard this about this certain individual. There's not going to be as much of that. So I think there's a potential for much more variance on draft boards. And we talked about that a little bit last year with the way that the pre-draft process was kind of short-circuited, was ended prematurely because of what happened beginning in mid-March with the country being locked down. But
it's hard to be the prettiest girl at the dance when there's no dance.
Sure, right. So you're not exchanging notes as much informally.
There's no Mike Mamula this year.
We don't think. Who knows? I mean, there still could be one, but I do think it's going to be really fascinating to see how that plays out. And if you're a team like the Ravens, who believe in their process and they use analytics and they've done things, they obviously have a process that goes back to the mid-90s that's worked very well, but it's certainly evolved over time. It'll be interesting to see how they fare and to see how the entire league fares, because it is a very different animal here. As I mentioned, I mean, you had a really unique college football season. You had a lot of really talented players who did not play in 2020. And look, that's fine. That was their right to decide to do that. But it does make the evaluation process much more difficult. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. And I would predict, not that you see a bunch of mock drafts that nail the draft every year, because that's just not the way it works. But I would not at all be surprised if we see more variance than ever in terms of maybe not the top 10, but beyond that, guys that are anticipated as, being picked in the teens, let's say, middle of the first round, and maybe they wind up early in the second round, or guys that, that pundits think are a mid-second round pick, that guy's in the middle of the first round. We always have a little bit of that. Inevitably, there are at least a couple examples of that every year. I think there's a potential for way more of that this year because, again, you're not having as much of the informal exchanging of notes at the combine and at pro days and things of that nature.
Well, for every Matt Miller or Lance Zierlein or these guys that I hope to have on in the coming weeks, at least once a week to keep everybody fresh on this, part of the fun of that job. And, that was a job I would have loved to have had 25 years ago and sitting around with Phil Savage and Marvin Lewis in 1997 and 98 and drawing up draft cards. But part of it, even then before the internet, was, all right, here's my list of best players, but here's who's Al Davis is going to take. with that wide receiver with the 12th pick or whatever wacky pick is going to be out there. Mike Ditka throwing a board, the Ricky Williams year and all that,
Yeah.
that these things just get torched, immediately when you don't have Peyton Manning and Ryan Leaf going 1 and 1A off the board. But I would say that the mock draft world, most of the plugged in people, the mock draft is about who they're going to take, not who I think they should take,
Right.
literally, right? And that's how I think in the modern era, this thing's evolved to being, relatively close. I mean, most of these draft nights, Lamar sitting around at the end of the night, that wasn't, nobody thought that was impossible. Maybe Aaron Rodgers, but there's a little bit of weirdness with the quarterback position. But by and large, most players that are first-round guys, they wind up being gone by 50. And they all can't be first-rounders.
Sure.
There's 75 guys that get a first-round tag. There's 32 picks. So, but most years, the pundits and all of the ears and eyes get it pretty close.
They do, and I mean, it's really a credit to them and the work that they put in. But it goes back to what I said a couple minutes ago. This year, I don't know if we'll see that quite as much because I just think there's more volatility. I think there's so much unknown. I think Eric DeCosta says it every year at the pre-draft luncheon. And look, I mean, it's not as though Eric's providing details and not as though he's 100% truthful. We call it the liar's luncheon for a reason every year. But he pretty confidently assesses that he can figure out if the Ravens in a given year are picking 23rd, he can predict who most of the teams ahead of him are going to take, or they'll get it down to 2 players, and that gives them the ability to have a general sense of the 3 or 4 guys on their board when they're picking, whether it's 27th, whether it's 16th, whatever it is any given year. You have a better idea of who's going to be there. And yeah, are there surprises? Sure. I mean, the Ravens didn't think Terrell Suggs was going to be there at 10th in 2003. I mean, you have those examples, but for the most part, you can kind of figure that out. So it'll be interesting to see, with the intel that guys have. And look, it's not as though guys around the league can't talk. It's not as though it's so much different this year. You still have texting and you have Zoom and things of that nature, but it will be interesting to see if, like I said, I really anticipate more volatility and a few more surprises here and there.
Wild West draft.
Yeah, I mean, it lends itself to that. I mean, we talked about that last year, and that was only because some pro days got canceled, right? I mean, this is an entire year of scouts having limited or no ability to go see certain sites, to go visit with players at certain colleges. I mean, it's a very different dynamic. So all I have to say is you better trust your people and you better trust your ability to watch tape. And I mean, that's where a team like the Ravens, as much as they look at data from the combine and as much as measurables do matter and you take that into account, they always say what? You have to stay true to the tape. Well, you hope that the tape that you got that might only be 5 or 6 games as opposed to 12 or 13, and you're going back and looking at the 2019 season in some cases with players who opted out or players who are at a program that did not, look at 1AA FCS football. I mean, they didn't play many conferences
well,
back
Joe
in the
Douglas
fall.
talked at length about having relationships at these schools, that's going to be everything as to if you know the coach at Richmond, can that kid play or can he not?
And is he the kind of person that's going to fit in well here? Is he from a culture standpoint? I mean, those questions are important. They're not the end all be all. I mean, ultimately, guy has to be able to play. I mean, you can be the best character guy in the world. If you can't play, you can't
but there was a culture issue.
And there's that. Yeah, I mean, there's always that balance. There's no question. So I'm really interested to see what this is going to look like. And look, the draft will happen in late April like it always does. They'll pick players. People will give premature grades. Teams like the Ravens always grade well right after the fact because they're highly respected and their track record suggests that. But we won't really know what impact this has really for a couple more years. That's what I think is going to be interesting to kind of grade the 2020 draft class, grade the 2021 draft class in 2023, 2024, and see what it looks like. Is it a case where the Ravens did extremely well and better than they normally do compared to the rest of the league? Or will there be a couple more missteps that just because the process was different that they'll miss on a guy? We'll see. And that's not a unique that's not a unique problem for the Ravens. That's everyone in the league right now. So it's definitely, as we've said so many times over the last 12 months, definitely uncharted territory. That's for sure.
You can find Luke at Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and social and Instagram and Facebook and all those other places as we get ready for baseball season around here and pitchers and catchers reporting. No media allowed. I love that up on the front door of Sarasota. So it allows all the rest of them to feel a little bit of my pain over the last 15 years. We're going to have some fun around here. I've been finding some old stuff. I want to give a shout out to all of our sponsors now that I have the background here. I'm going to have a sponsor bag with stuff like Liberty Pure Water that I have to hold up against my body. I'm learning how to do this stuff now, that I have to go like this in order to make it work. And our friends at Royal Farms, real fresh, real fast, and the tasty coffee, always brewed fresh. I have all sorts of little gadgets and gadgets around here, little fun things. My friends from, well, I have to hold it up like this in front of my head. There you go. Raskin Global. This is lip balm, actually, that Leonard gives me. My guys at Blondell Miller Schuler, damn good lawyer, they haven't given me – oh, a little minty. They haven't really given me anything, but my friends at Pizza John's at least have given me a cup. I had pizza, but I ate it all. So I appreciate all the sponsors around here, including our friends at Planet Fitness. I may actually plaster some stuff up here, or take a picture of some bobbleheads, or do some weird stuff. But now that I've learned virtual background here at WNST and Baltimore Positive, I'm going to be dangerous, I promise. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, Towson, Baltimore, keeping it real all February long. And Don will be joining me in a moment as well.